בראשית ברא אלוהים את השמיים ואת הארץ.
In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good.
From the San Diego, California headquarters of the Institute for Creation Research, here are ICR scientists and Back to Genesis lecturers Dr. John D. Morris and Ken Ham.
You know, for many years it's been said that the fossil record is where you go to find proof that evolution has happened.
And most people think that the fossils require and represent millions of years to be produced, but Dr. Gish thinks otherwise. Nearly 20 years ago, he wrote what may be the biggest selling creationist book of all, Evolution, the Fossils Say No.
And in that book, he pointed out that the fossil record is really an embarrassment to evolution. There's no clue in the fossil record that any basic category of animal ever changed into another basic category of animal. And yet the fossil record is exactly what it should be, if creation is true. Fascinating material in that book and in this program. Let's watch.
It is commonly assumed by most people that the fossil record provides the support for evolution. And of course, that should be the case. That really should be the case if evolution is true. What greater evidence for evolution could we have than the fossil record? After all, the fossil record is the record of life that we have inscribed in the rocks. And if evolution is true, then of course that fossil record should provide the very best evidence for evolution. Well, what evidence should we expect from the fossil record if evolution is true? Well, evolutionists believe that life began about 3 billion years ago, plus or minus a few 100 million years, and that life began as some little microscopic organism, maybe something like a bacterium or amoeba or something like that. And during the vast stretch of time since that time, hundreds of millions of years, this little microscopic organism has diversified and evolved into everything living today and that has ever lived. Now, if that's true, then I think you could see that this process would have produced literally billions times billions times billions of transitional form or intermediate types. As that little microscopic organism evolved into a multicellular organism, and then this multicellular organism diversified into the vast array of complex invertebrates that now exist and have existed, and then that invertebrate, whether it be a clam or a snail or a jellyfish or a worm or something like that, gradually evolved into a fish or the vertebrates. And then this fish evolved into amphibians, and of course that would require that the fins would gradually change into feet and legs, and of course many other changes would have to take place for a fish to change into an amphibian. Then we are told the amphibian evolved into reptiles, and then reptiles evolved into birds, and that means of course the scale of the reptile had to gradually change into feathers, and the forelimbs of the reptile had to change gradually into wings. That would have produced an enormous number of intermediate stages. And of course, it is suggested the reptile evolved into mammals, and mammals evolved into the higher mammals or primates, and primates evolved into people. Supposedly, this process took place over these hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And of course, according to evolution theory, it is the successful organism that evolves. What is the successful organism? The one that reproduces in larger numbers. So there be very large populations of these intermediates. You cannot claim that the intermediates would be inefficient. They would not be very highly suited, you see, to survive, so they'd be in few numbers. No, that's not true at all. According to evolution, it is a successful organism that evolves, and the successful organism is the one who reproduces in larger numbers. So at all times during this evolutionary process, there'd be very large population of these evolving creatures, or the intermediate forms, or the transitional types, you see. Therefore, evolution would have produced an enormous number of intermediates or transitional forms. Billions times billions of those things would have lived and died. If evolution is true, our museum should contain millions and millions and millions of fossils of these intermediates. Today in our museums we have about 250,000 different fossil species, represented by tens of millions of cataloged fossils. 250,000. Now, if evolution is true, quite obviously, then tens of thousands of those fossils should be of intermediate types. Why? There should be no doubt about the fact of evolution. It should be the most well-established fact known in science. All we'd have to do is just look at the fossils right there in front of us. On the museum shelves, in the museum displays, we would have abundant evidence of the fact of evolution. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd expect something very different, wouldn't we? If creation is true, you see, each one of the basic types of plant and animals, what one might call basic morphological designs, or what we creationists would call the created kinds, they would appear abruptly, fully formed, right at the start. You see immediately a clam would be a clam, snail would be a snail, jellyfish would be a jellyfish, an onion would be an onion, and a lily would be a lily, a tiger would be a tiger, monkeys would be monkeys, and people would be people. We would expect to find the fossils, you see, of each basic type appearing fully formed with no evidence that these basic types have arisen from a common ancestor. Now, there'd be variation within the limits of each kind, of course. We know today we have many races of people. We have many varieties of dogs. As Darwin noted when he visited the Galapagos Islands, there are many varieties of finches. But you see, what the creationist points out is that those finches in the Galapagos Islands are not only still birds, they're still finches. And we may have many varieties of dogs, but they are all dogs. As you note, that you can't cross a dog with a cat and get a dat or something like that. You can't get that sort of mixed breed today. And as creationists, we'd not expect to find any of that evidence in the past. That is in the fossil record. So you see, the predictions based upon creation and evolution are vastly different. The evolutionist says we begin with simple forms which gradually change in more and more complex forms, produce an enormous number of transitional forms, showing that one organism really did change into another. You see, even if we knew that fishes came after the invertebrates, that would not prove at all that fishes came from the invertebrates. What we need for that evidence is the actual existence of these intermediate forms, the transitional forms that would have been produced as some invertebrate became a vertebrate or a fish. On the other hand, the creationist prediction would be very, very different in that. Sudden appearance of each kind with no ancestors and no intermediate form. Now let us look at the fossil record and see what the fossil record produces. Does it produce these intermediate forms demanded by the theory of evolution? Or do we find that the gaps in the fossil record are systematic? That is, we do not find at any level any intermediate forms. We should expect the phyla, the classes, the orders, families, down to including the genera at least, each would appear fully formed with no transitional form. Now we want to look at first at creatures that are found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe that Cambrian rocks began to form about 600 million years ago. And they believe now if you took all of these Cambrian rocks scattered all over the world, totaled them all up, assuming the sediment that formed those rocks settled out of the water just a fraction of an inch per year, it would take something like 80 million years for these Cambrian rocks to form. Now, first of all, how do we know that a Cambrian rock is a Cambrian rock? By the type of fossil that's found in those rocks. No matter whether the rocks are on the very surface, whether they're buried deep in the earth, or some intermediate point. We call it a Cambrian rock if it has certain types of fossils. The index fossils for Cambrian rocks generally is some type of a trilobite or a brachiopod. Now, in these Cambrian rocks are billions times billions of fossils of very complex invertebrates. Now, first of all, I would not have the slightest idea how you would get fossils under conditions suggested by evolutionists. If you have sediment settling out of the water just a fraction of an inch per year, you see, it would take a long time for a rock to accumulate and to entomb the fossil. Now, when an animal dies and just lies around on the ground or floats around in the water, you don't get a fossil that way because scavengers will consume it, or oxidation or other deteriorative processes would destroy the creature. Bones, teeth, and everything. Nothing remains. For a fossil to form, it must be buried. The creature must be buried, and be buried very quickly in order to preserve it, you see. Now, in these rocks, we have this enormous number of fossils. We believe that these were produced not by slow, gradual deposition over hundreds of millions of years of time, but were produced catastrophically. They'd have to be produced catastrophically in order for these fossils to form. We believe that much of the fossil record was produced by the flood described in the book of Genesis. But regardless of how they got there or when they got there they are. And their existence demands an explanation. In the Cambrian rocks, we find these very, very complicated creatures. We find fossils of jellyfish and sponges, brachiopods, trilobites, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, clams, snails, worms, and a great variety of other very complex invertebrates. Now, as I mentioned earlier, evolutionists believe that these things evolved beginning with a little microscopic organism. Now, if that's true, then in the rocks which generally underlie the Cambrian rocks, they're called Precambrian rocks. And by the way, many of these Precambrian rocks are perfectly preserved, suitable for the preservation of fossils. They are undisturbed. And if the fossils are there, they certainly should be found in those Precambrian rocks. Now, based upon evolutionary theory, of course, the Precambrian rocks must contain the evolutionary ancestors of these very complicated invertebrates. Billions times billions of fossils of those transitional forms or ancestors should be there. Now, in those Precambrian rocks are found fossils of little microscopic, single-celled, soft-bodied bacteria and algae. Now, I believe you will agree that if we can find fossils of little soft-bodied microscopic bacteria in those Precambrian rocks, we certainly should be able to find all of the transitional forms between those microscopic organisms and these complicated invertebrates. That is, if evolution really has taken place. Those rocks, you see, if evolution is true, must produce the history of evolution between the microscopic organism and these complicated invertebrates. What do we actually find in those Precambrian rocks? Well, they've been searched all over the world intensely ever since Darwin. Bottoms of the oceans have been searched, but nowhere on the face of this earth have we been able to find a fossil of an ancestor for a single one of those complicated invertebrates. Not one. Trilobites, when we first see them, they are trilobite. They are complete. And they are very complicated creatures with eyes that have astounded the scientists. The eyes they have shown perfect vision. And we have clams and snails and all of these other very complicated invertebrates. A vast array of complicated invertebrates are found in those Cambrian rocks. And we have not found ancestors for a single one, not even one. They all appear fully formed right at the start. Now, evolutionists have termed this the major mystery of the history of life. The creation scientists, on the other hand, said, what greater evidence for creation could the rocks give than this explosive appearance of this vast array of complicated invertebrates without a trace of an ancestor? Now, evolution cannot be true. You just could not have hundreds of millions of years of evolution without leaving a trace. That's just not physically possible. Now, furthermore, evolutionists suggest that one of these invertebrates evolved into a fish. Now, fishes are supposed to be the first vertebrates. Now, to the evolutionists, where would a vertebrate come from? Where would fishes come from? Where else could they come from? They'd have to come from some invertebrate, you see. So, they say, as an article of faith, that fishes evolved from invertebrates, or some invertebrate. They believe it took 100 million years. Why, during that 100 million years, billions times billions of the transitional form between some invertebrate and a fish, you see, would have been produced. Fishes are vertebrates like you and me. They have an internal skeleton. They have a backbone. The invertebrates found in those Cambrian rocks are either soft-bodied like the jellyfish or worms, or they may have a shell or an exoskeleton such as a trilobite. And so we have the invertebrate evolving into the vertebrate. 100 million years. Billions times billions times billions of the intermediate should have been produced. Our museum should have millions and millions and millions of fossils of the transitional form showing what invertebrate evolved into a fish and the course of that evolution. As a matter of fact, they don't even have one. Not even one fossil of a transitional form between the invertebrate and the fish. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed right at the start without a trace of an ancestor. In my many debates, I have challenged my evolutionary opponents with these major facts. I said, please explain to this audience how you could have 100 million years of evolution, during which time some invertebrate evolves into a fish, and yet not leave a trace. I have always been met with thunderous silence. They say not a word. They offer no explanation. They don't even try to answer the challenge, because you see, they have no answer. There is no answer. It is not physically possible. That really settles the matter of the fossil record. We really don't have to talk about Archaeopteryx or any of these other things, because we've already settled the matter. Evolution has not taken place on this earth.